The winter sky over the northern Ardennes looked like iron the morning the forgotten company first heard the rumble. It was December 1944, a month when breath turned instantly to crystals and rifles jammed before sunrise, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Across a narrow valley choked by pines and snow, 20,000 German troops were pushing west in the opening thrust of the offensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. But to the men of the isolated American company scattered along an unmarked ridge, it was simply another day of cold, hunger, and silence, until the forest began to vibrate beneath them. This was the day when a handful of men, misplaced on the wrong side of a frozen map, accidentally stood in the path of an entire army. They had been sent forward 2 nights earlier, or at least that was the intention. Orders had come down in fragments, distorted by failing radios and officers trying to track units across terrain swallowed by storms. The company belonged nominally to the 78th Infantry Division, though even that was questionable. Their battalion command post had moved during the night without informing them, leaving the men effectively unattached. No one back at headquarters realized they were still sitting on the ridge, and no German scout expected resistance in that specific stretch of woods. They were ghosts before the battle even started, carved into the landscape, unknown to friend or foe. Captain Warren Hale, a quiet man with hollow cheeks and gloves that had long since given up trying to keep his hands warm, walked the line just after dawn, checking foxholes that had become small caves of frozen mud. The ridge sloped sharply down to a single road, half buried and slick, curving around a bend like a narrow throat. It was a perfect choke point, though none of the Americans had been sent here with that in mind. They were merely waiting for new instructions, staring at the empty road and trying not to think about the quiet that felt falsely peaceful. Hale swallowed a taste of metal, something like fear mixed with frost, when he saw the first cloud of dust rising between the trees. It was faint, almost gentle, but unmistakably moving. The men tightened their grips on rifles whose bolts resisted under the cold. They had maybe 180 soldiers on paper, closer to 160 actually present, divided into 3 understrength platoons. Their ammunition had been rationed down to desperation levels. 3 functioning .30 caliber machine guns, a single 60mm mortar with barely a dozen rounds, and grenades with fuses so delicate they had to be warmed in pockets before use. They were not a force meant to stop anything, much less an entire German column fresh from the opening hours of one of the most ambitious offensives of the war. Yet the rumble in the valley grew louder, rolling like distant thunder, until even the frozen ground seemed to pulse. When the first German armored car appeared around the bend, Hale whispered something that died in the cold air, and his men instinctively sank lower into their positions. The vehicle advanced with confidence, followed by more, their line stretching back farther than the eye could see. Infantry marched behind them, dark shapes blotting the whiteness of the road, rifles slung casually, unaware that eyes watched from the ridge above. No one in the American company spoke, not even to themselves. It was a silence carried by disbelief. If the Germans continued without interference, they would sweep past St. Vith within hours. And if the Americans opened fire, they would reveal themselves to a force that could swallow them whole. Hale crouched between 2 machine gunners, his boots sinking into icy slush. The men looked at him with an unspoken question. Now? He did not answer immediately. He knew their true assignment had been lost, that they were never intended to hold this ground. But he also knew what 20,000 Germans advancing unchallenged could do to the fragile Allied line behind them. Minutes stretched like wire. The armored car at the front slowed as if sensing something off about the quiet valley, its engine idling in the cold. Somewhere down the line, an officer barked an order, though the Americans could not understand the words, only the tone. Hale finally exhaled, a thin ribbon of vapor rising into the freezing air. He gave a small, tired nod. The first machine gun cracked, a burst that echoed through the trees like a scream. The armored car's windshield shattered instantly, the vehicle jerking sideways before sliding into the ditch. Chaos swept the German line. Soldiers dove for cover, slipping on the snow, scrambling behind stalled vehicles. Officers tried to restore order, shouting over the sudden explosion of return fire. The Americans kept their heads down, firing in controlled bursts, using the terrain like a shield. Hale felt the recoil of each decision in his bones. He had not intended to start a battle. He had intended to delay, perhaps for minutes, maybe long enough to reposition. But the Germans, stunned by unexpected resistance at such a narrow point, hesitated, and in war, hesitation is a wound that spreads quickly. The narrow road became a bottleneck in seconds. As more German vehicles tried to push forward, they ran into those already disabled or swerving for cover. Engines roared, treads spun helplessly, and the curve of the road turned into a wall of metal. The snow muffled everything yet amplified every impact, shouted commands, ricocheting rounds, splintering wood. The Americans, still invisible behind their ridge positions, kept firing with the precision of men who knew every bullet mattered. Below them, the German line tried to reorganize, sending infantry scrambling into the trees, but the deep drifts and dense branches slowed them to a crawl. Midway through the chaos, Hale realized something. The Germans believed they were facing far more than a single forgotten company. They were acting as if a battalion, maybe more, had entrenched along the ridge. They deployed cautiously, advancing by small squads instead of overwhelming force. They waited for armored support that could not push through the traffic jam behind them. A mistake, born from confusion and terrain, began to grow into opportunity. Hale watched a German officer collapse behind a tree, struck by a lucky shot. The enemy withdrew a few meters, regrouping. It bought the Americans seconds, then minutes, then a precious hour. Snowflakes drifted down as the first waves of German fire intensified, cracking through branches overhead and sending bark flying. The Americans repositioned machine guns, their breath coming in harsh bursts. A mortar team fired twice before going silent to conserve the last few rounds. The forest became a maze of smoke and silhouettes, and the ridge trembled with the sustained roar of battle. Hale ran between foxholes, slipping, stumbling, shouting directions through the din. He felt the weight of time pressing on his shoulders. They could not win. They were not meant to win. But as long as they held, they were a barrier no one had predicted. And somewhere far behind them, reinforcements they would never see were gathering, unaware that their tenuous opportunity existed only because a company nobody remembered had chosen to stay where no one expected them to be. The men on the ridge continued firing as the sun climbed behind the gray curtain of clouds, their faces numb, their hands burning from cold steel, the road below still choked with halted troops. Hale glanced once more at the horizon, understanding for the first time that the battle had begun not by strategy but by accident, and that accidents, in war, could shape the fate of an entire front. Fire rolled through the pines as the morning deepened, turning the ridge into a trembling line of muzzle flashes, drifting smoke, and men pressed so low against the earth they seemed welded to it. German infantry attempted to regroup below, shouting orders that rose and faded with the wind, but every attempt to push up the slope met another burst from the American machine guns hidden behind fallen logs and frozen embankments. Hale moved from position to position, not so much commanding as steadying, touching shoulders, adjusting helmets, reminding the men to conserve a few rounds for when they'd need them most. The snow, once pristine, had become a churned mixture of blackened powder and shattered branches. Somewhere near the curve of the road, a German half-track burned with a dull orange glow that flickered behind veils of smoke. The enemy response grew methodically. German squads began working their way into the trees, using the natural cover to climb the ridge at an angle. Hale saw them through the gaps, dark shapes moving with purpose, rifles held tight, boots kicking through the drifts. He signaled a pair of riflemen to shift left, but the moment they crawled from one depression to another, a burst of automatic fire raked the ground around them. One man dragged himself behind a stump, gasping, blood spreading across the white surface beneath him. The other remained still, his helmet rolling a few inches downward before sinking into the snow. Hale forced himself not to look longer than necessary. Every second spent staring at death was a second he wasn't buying what little time remained. A single German mortar crew set up near the lower tree line, lobbing shells in high arcs that whistled down toward the ridge. The first landed wide, thundering uselessly against rocks. The second detonated closer, showering a machine gun team with dirt and splinters. Hale barked for the mortar team, and they responded with one of their last rounds, firing blind between two pines. The explosion cut off the German crew mid-command. The forest swallowed the sound quickly, but the momentary silence afterward felt heavier than the roar had been. Hale's mortarman looked at him and lifted 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, silent count of how much ammunition remained. Hale nodded grimly, knowing even those remaining rounds would likely be gone within minutes. But what neither Hale nor his men could see from their vantage point was the extent of the chaos their resistance had sparked far down the road. The column behind the front vehicle stretched for kilometers, but it had been designed to move with speed and precision. Now, with the lead armored car disabled and panic rippling through the infantry, the entire line began to freeze. Vehicles jammed the road, their engines steaming, drivers shouting at one another over the grinding gears. Officers attempted to force discipline, but the narrow terrain betrayed them. A single stalled vehicle became a barricade, 2 became a wall, 5 created a steel dam that no one could bypass without leaving the safety of the road. German artillery units trapped behind could not deploy. Tanks further back could not push forward. A force of 20,000 found itself throttled by a mere handful of riflemen on a ridge. As the hours passed, the American ammunition dwindled. Hale's machine gunners changed barrels with hands stiff from cold, the metal scorching even through gloves. German fire peppered the ridge from 3 sides now, probing for gaps. A platoon of Volksgrenadiers made a daring rush up the center, charging through waist-deep snow while firing from the hip. The Americans responded with everything left to them, mowing down the front rank, forcing the survivors to dive behind a fallen pine whose trunk was already riddled with hundreds of bullets. Hale crawled toward the right flank, hearing a frantic voice shouting for help. He found Corporal Dill, one of the younger replacements, pressing a rag against his own leg, blood seeping through his fingers. "Stay low," Hale murmured, ripping open a field dressing. Dill's breathing rattled, his face pale beneath a crust of frost. Hale finished bandaging him, propped him against the interior of the foxhole, and squeezed his shoulder. Dill nodded weakly, then pointed toward the forest with shaking fingers. More Germans! The enemy had adapted. They no longer attempted broad pushes up the ridge but small, coordinated assaults along narrow channels. Hale warned the nearest section, and the men shifted their fire accordingly. But the forest was a labyrinth, hiding enemy movements until they were almost on top of the American line. At one point, a German squad came within 10 yards of an outlying foxhole before Private Stillman spotted their silhouettes. His shout carried just long enough to alert the men beside him before a grenade landed near the lip of the position. The explosion tore open the frozen ground, sending earth and shards of ice into the air. Stillman staggered backward, his ears ringing, but remained upright, raising his rifle with trembling hands. Hale watched him fire 3 shots, each one deliberate. The German squad faltered, then melted back into the trees, their opportunity lost. Hale glanced at the sky. Hours had passed, he wasn't sure how many. The sun remained hidden behind a curtain of gray, its presence felt only through a faint brightening of the clouds. His watch had stopped, its gears stiffened by the cold. He had no sense of the larger battle, no knowledge of whether the Allies were holding elsewhere. All he knew was that his men were running dangerously low on ammunition. Some had only 2 or 3 magazines left. The machine guns were sputtering, each burst shorter than the last. The mortar had fired its final round. Hale crouched behind a log, rubbing his forehead with a hand that felt numb to the wrist, trying to calculate how many minutes remained before they could no longer defend themselves. A rifle crack from the left flank snapped him back. Hale sprinted through the snow, crouching low, sliding into a shallow depression beside a team of riflemen who were firing at a new formation of Germans advancing through a gully. This was no probing force. They were organized, precise, and supported by a light machine gun whose tracer rounds stitched the ridge with deadly accuracy. Hale shouted for the remaining grenades. 3 men fumbled through their pockets, handing him the last usable ones, their fuses warm from body heat. Hale distributed them, pointing to the gully. The men nodded in silence. They waited for a gap in the German fire, then hurled their grenades in wide arcs. The explosions tore through the gully, lifting snow in massive plumes. German cries rose sharply, then disappeared into the forest's white hush. A fresh wave of small arms fire erupted below the ridge, this time accompanied by the distinct roar of a tank engine. Hale's heart sank. He moved toward the central command position, where Sergeant Kramer was perched behind binoculars. Kramer's jaw was clenched, the muscles beneath his stubble twitching. "Panzer on the bend," he muttered, gesturing downward. Hale followed the gesture and felt a chill deeper than the cold already penetrating him. A German tank had nosed its way to the front of the tangled line, its turret swiveling slowly as it tried to assess the source of resistance. Hale knew that if the tank opened fire with its main gun, the ridge would become a death trap. The men had almost no anti-tank capability. The PIAT launchers they carried were unreliable in the cold, and their angles of fire were nearly impossible from the ridge's steep incline. The tank advanced only a few yards before stopping behind the wreck of the armored car. Its crew, frustrated by the chaos ahead and unsure of what lay above, hesitated. Hale prayed that hesitation would last. He remembered the chaotic first minutes of the battle, the low visibility conditions, the curve of the road, all variables combining to make the Americans seem larger than they were. The Germans had spent hours reacting to phantoms on a ridge. Hale knew that once the illusion broke, the tank would push forward and annihilate them. He pressed a hand against the frozen ground, as if willing the earth itself to hold the tank in place. The sound of gears grinding forward, then backward, suggested that even the Panzer's crew was uncertain whether to risk moving. Kramer lowered the binoculars and looked at Hale with a grim smile. "They think we have artillery up here," he said. "Or a full regiment. Must be wondering why we haven't brought in heavy guns." Hale didn't answer. He moved to another foxhole, where 2 of his oldest soldiers were reloading. They looked exhausted, hollow-eyed. One passed Hale a battered canteen. The water inside had partially frozen. He took a sip that burned like ice and handed it back. A distant explosion echoed from somewhere deeper in the valley, German engineers attempting to clear the wreckage on the road. Hale realized the Germans were preparing for another push. Once the road was clear, nothing would stop them. A sharp, urgent whistle sounded from the far right flank. Hale sprinted toward it, breath tearing through his chest. He found Lieutenant Mercer crouched beside a tree, pointing down the slope. A German squad had navigated a narrow ravine unnoticed, emerging dangerously close to the American defensive line. They were climbing quickly, using exposed roots as handholds. If they breached the ridge at that point, the entire company would be flanked. Mercer and 2 riflemen fired desperately, dropping one enemy soldier, then another, but the rest pushed upward with fierce determination. Hale raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel with steady hands despite the shaking in his bones. He fired, once, twice, 3 times. 2 Germans fell backward into the ravine. The rest hesitated, then scrambled for cover, buying the Americans yet another precious minute. Then came the moment Hale dreaded. Kramer shouted from the central line, "Captain, we're down to maybe 20 minutes of ammo, less if they push hard." Hale heard the words as though someone else had spoken them. His mind flickered with the knowledge that they had done what they could, more, even, yet the battle was far from over for the Germans pressing the attack. He scanned the ridge, taking in the scattered positions, the men lying prone behind makeshift ramparts, the silent figures who had stopped moving hours ago. He tasted the cold air, filled with gunpowder and pine. They were nearing the limit. Soon they would have to choose between surrender, death, or escape into the forest. A distant horn sounded from the German side, long and low. Hale felt the vibration of it more than he heard it. The Germans were preparing a final push, something organized, something decisive. He knew the sound well. It meant an assault supported by everything left at their disposal. He ran along the line one last time, shouting encouragement, touching shoulders, reminding the exhausted men that their fight, however long it lasted, was buying time for the rest of the front. Snowflakes drifted through the drifting smoke, landing silently on helmets and cheeks. The ridge, shaking under the weight of battle all morning, now seemed to hold its breath again. Below them, the German line gathered, shapes forming behind the wreckage, rifles ready, engines revving. Hale felt the ground tremble. The Americans raised their weapons, their last magazines already loaded. And as the forest darkened under the shadow of the advancing troops, Hale understood with absolute clarity that the end was coming, but not yet, not while they still held this ridge. The horn faded into the cold air, and the German line surged forward with a determination that shook the ridge like a living force. Hale felt it before he saw it. The pressure of thousands of boots pushing through the drifts, the snap of branches, the sharp metallic cough of rifles firing in unison. He shouted for every available man to focus fire on the center, knowing full well that this final assault would be the one to break them. The Americans pulled their rifles tight, bracing for the impact, their breath rising in white clouds that dissipated instantly in the wind. The first wave came fast. German infantry moved in staggered lines, slipping between trees, diving behind exposed roots, rushing the slope from three directions. Hale's men responded with their last bursts of fire, short, calculated shots from rifles nearly frozen in their hands. The machine guns clattered, each burst shorter than the last. The survivors on the ridge fought with the knowledge that every bullet mattered more than the previous one. The crack of incoming fire became constant, a barrage that shredded branches overhead and sent pine needles cascading like rain. A group of Germans broke through the lower tree line on the left, sprinting up the incline with bayonets fixed. Private Stillman, still half-deaf from earlier blasts, caught their movement and screamed a warning. Two American riflemen pivoted, firing point blank. 3 Germans fell, tumbling down the slope with their coats flaring behind them. The rest dropped prone, firing upward, bullets carving furrows into the frozen soil. Hale slid into the nearest foxhole, grabbing Stillman by the collar and pulling him down just as a burst of automatic fire ripped through the air where the young private's head had been moments before. The ridge shook again. This time, the sound came from the right flank, an entire German platoon charging up a shallow ravine. Hale sprinted across the line, stumbling through churned snow, sliding behind fallen trunks. He reached the ravine just as Sergeant Mercer hurled their last grenade. It detonated halfway down the slope, lighting up the forest with a violet flare that sent shards of ice flying outward. The German formation faltered, scattering behind whatever cover the terrain allowed. Mercer looked at Hale, chest heaving, and shook his head. "No more grenades," he said. "No more anything." Hale stared down at the ravine, watching enemy soldiers regroup with grim efficiency. They knew the Americans were nearly spent. They had sensed it, perhaps from the decreasing volume of fire, perhaps from the silence creeping between each rifle shot. A German officer barked a command, and the platoon surged forward again. Hale raised his rifle, firing until the bolt stuck, frozen in place. He struck it with his palm, trying to free it, but the metal refused to obey. He tossed the weapon aside and reached for another from a fallen soldier beside him, but even as he lifted it, he realized the ammunition was gone. All along the ridge, similar scenes unfolded, men firing their last rounds, shouting for spare magazines that no one had left, striking frozen bolts against helmets in desperate attempts to squeeze out a final shot. The remaining machine guns sputtered and fell silent. A dreadful quiet began to settle, not the peaceful sort, but the kind that comes when a line finally reaches its limit. Hale felt the shift in the battle like a change in temperature. The resistance that had held the Germans at bay for so many hours was collapsing. He called out through the trees, voice hoarse and cracking, ordering the men to fall back into the forest. There was no need to shout twice. They understood instantly. They abandoned positions they had defended all morning, scrambling over roots and fallen branches, retreating into the maze of dark pines where visibility dropped to mere yards. German fire followed them like angry hornets, shredding bark, chipping stones, filling the woods with splintered shrapnel. Hale grabbed Stillman, who was struggling to stand, and slung his arm over his shoulder. They moved together through the steep terrain, stumbling as the ridge behind them fell to German forces. More Americans joined the retreat, their faces pale and hollow, eyes sunken from exhaustion. Some limped, others crawled. A handful carried wounded comrades over their shoulders, refusing to leave anyone behind despite the danger. Hale steered them deeper into the forest, knowing the terrain well enough to trust its natural cover. German voices echoed behind them, followed by scattered rifle shots and the metallic roar of a tank engine repositioning for a better angle. But the forest absorbed sound like a sponge. Within minutes, the survivors had melted into the shadows. They did not stop moving for nearly an hour. Hale forced himself forward one agonizing step at a time, guiding his men down a narrow ravine and across a frozen creek bed. When he finally called for a halt, the men collapsed behind a cluster of boulders, their breaths coming in ragged, icy bursts. Hale lowered Stillman carefully, checking his pulse with trembling fingers. The young private managed a weak smile. "We're still here," he whispered. Hale nodded, though the weight of what they'd endured hung heavy in the air. Around them, the forest hummed with the distant sounds of German movement, but the front had shifted, the momentum broken. The Germans had finally secured the ridge, yet their advance was hours behind schedule. Twilight crept across the Ardennes, painting the snow in shades of ash and silver. The enemy would consolidate their position, reorganize the wounded, clear the wreckage on the road, and prepare for the next phase of the offensive. But the one thing they could not reclaim was the time lost that morning. Hours, precious, irreversible, had been stolen from them by a company no one had expected to be there. When darkness finally settled, Hale took stock of the survivors. The company had started the day with roughly 160 men. Fewer than half remained. Some were missing behind the ridge, their fates unknown. Others lay wounded among the trees, awaiting evacuation that might take hours or might never come. Hale wrote down their names in a small notebook, hands shaking, breath misting over the page. He paused at each name of the fallen, staring at the ink as if the act of writing them kept the men alive in some fragile way. Hours later, as Hale led the survivors through the darkness toward friendly lines, he glanced back at the ridge. The distant glow of burning vehicles lit the curve of the road like a broken halo. Snow fell softly, covering fresh tracks, concealing scars carved by fire and steel. It was as if the forest itself wished to erase the memory of the battle. But Hale knew better. The ridge would not be forgotten, not by him, not by the survivors, and not by the commanders who would later realize what had happened there. To the Germans, it would be a frustrating footnote, a mysterious delay caused by unexpected resistance. To historians, it would become one of hundreds of stories overshadowed by larger battles. But to the men who had stood on that ridge, it would remain the moment when they lost, misplaced, and nearly erased, held back an entire army by accident. Hale felt the enormity of it settle in his chest like heat against the cold. When the survivors finally reached the outskirts of the Allied lines, they were met by stunned officers who had not even known the company had been deployed in that sector. Hale explained, in simple, clipped words, what had happened. The officers listened in growing disbelief. One checked the maps repeatedly, insisting there had been no friendly forces recorded along that ridge. Hale merely nodded. That was precisely why they had been forgotten. That was precisely why the Germans had never expected them. And that was precisely why they had bought so much time. Later, when word reached higher command, the significance of their accidental stand became clear. The delay had allowed reinforcement units to fortify St. Vith, preventing a rapid German breakthrough and altering the momentum of the offensive. The forgotten company had not stopped the enemy. They had not been expected to. They had only been expected to survive long enough to receive proper orders. Instead, they had changed the tempo of a campaign. In the days that followed, Hale and the remaining men were folded back into the larger division, their numbers too few to reform the company. Some were sent to medical wards, others reassigned to replacement units. The ridge faded behind them, swallowed by snow and new movements of war. But the memory of what they had done, of what they had endured, remained etched into the minds of the survivors like a scar they carried forward. And as the Ardennes winter deepened, commanders speaking in low voices began referring to the event in simple terms: the stand no one planned, the delay no one expected, the resistance no one noticed at the time. Hale, hearing these words, simply looked down at his hands, remembering the cold, the smoke, the trembling earth beneath his boots, and the faces of those who would never return. He knew the truth: the ridge had not been held by strategy, nor by superior firepower, nor even by luck. It had been held by men who refused to vanish without making their presence known. In the end, history would reduce it to a footnote. But for those who lived it, and for those who draw meaning from the stories carved into cold forests and winter soil, it remains a testament to how even the smallest forces can shape the fate of nations. On that ridge, against all odds, courage and circumstance intertwined to create a moment that rippled far beyond the trees. If you found this story powerful, consider liking the video to help keep these lesser-known chapters of history alive. If you want more narratives like this, subscribe and join our community of history keepers. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from. Your engagement ensures that stories like this one are never forgotten.